about college entrance examination testing for US admissions. I'm not going to talk about IBs though. We're going to do that in a separate video. So about the SAT-1 and ACT tests first. As a general rule, you should take the SAT-1 and ACTs at the very end, like in your 11th grade or 12th grade, because first of all, there are not as many tests that are released that you could practice. If you run out of those tests and there's no more tests that you can practice with, it becomes very difficult for test prep. So SAT-2s or AP subject tests you could take early, and it's natural to take them early as you take those courses in your 9th, 10th, or 11th grade. So that's a general rule of thumb. So SAT-2s and APs early, ACT and SAT-1 later in your high school tenure. So in the ACT and SAT-1 tests, there are writing tests. So with writing or without writing. So as a general rule of thumb, about 35 ranked universities in the US News and World Report college rankings, 35 rank or higher usually require writing tests in their ACT or SAT-1 test. So if you're applying to those universities, you need to take the writing test. If you're applying to universities that are below 35 rank, you could take the test without writing. So most people that are applying to universities, they might be applying to both universities over and under 35 ranks. So if that's the case, you might have to take both. That's actually a good thing maybe, because without writing you might get a better score. So with the SAT-1 writing, it's most similar to high school academic writing. And if you've done well in high school academic writing, then you will do fairly well in the SAT-1 writing. Now, a lot of students have difficulty with finishing the test. The ACT writing, however, is tricky. It's not difficult, but there are so many perspectives. There are 3 perspectives that you have to talk about, and you also have to give your own perspective or opinion on the essay topic. So it's very difficult to organize the essay into something that'll fit into 2.5, 3 pages or so, and to organize the body paragraphs very, very well. So it's tricky. So when to take the ACT or SAT-1? So the first time that you start studying for the ACT or SAT-1 should be at the end of your 10th grade during the summer. If you don't start by then, especially if you have difficulty with English because it's your second language, it's not good. So start studying by the end of your 10th grade during the summer at the end of your 10th grade, and then all the spring and summer breaks and winter breaks thereafter. Your first ACT or SAT-1 test should be in January of your 11th grade. That should be your first test, or about January of your 11th grade, because after you study all during winter vacation, the whole of January is not that busy. It's a lot of homecoming, it's a lot of parades, it's kind of like a festive atmosphere in the high school. So there's not a lot of going on. A lot of teachers don't assign very, very difficult homework or projects during the whole of January. So studying and taking the SAT-1 test that's given at the end of January, for instance, shouldn't be that difficult. The ACT test during that time is about the same too. So the second test should be May. Now you could take it in May or June for the SAT-1, but I recommend May because most people take the AP tests in May and also the SAT-2 tests in May. So if you take the SAT-1 test in May and the SAT-2 test in June, it's going against the flow and it'll be a lot easier. I know that it's a very difficult time to take the test because you have a lot of major projects coming up at that time, and there are a lot of essays and research papers, but that's the best date to take it anyway. Junior year is hell anyway. So you have to take it in stride and pace yourself, but take it you must at that time. The third and final test date, if you need it, should be in October of or September if it's the ACT, October if it's the SAT-1 of your senior year. Then you could maybe improve your score right before the early admissions, early decision deadlines. The SAT-2 subject tests. So the SAT-2 subject tests you should take, by the way, you don't need the SAT 2 subject tests if you take the ACT as a general rule. And if you take the ACT, however, but you're applying to like the top shelf universities like Harvard universities and all the Ivy League universities, you should still take the SAT 2 subject tests, like 2 of them, because they're more difficult than the ACT subject elements of the ACT test. So unless you're applying to top shelf universities, just taking the ACT alone, one alone, and nothing else will be good enough. The SAT 1, you do need to take the SAT 2s up to rank 35 universities. Okay, so take the 2 SAT 2 subject tests that you are the best in, that you can get the highest score in. Usually, a lot of universities do require, if they require any SAT 2s, they do require the math test. So math might be one of your 2 or 3. Your third one, some universities require a third because they don't look at your writing score, like Johns Hopkins and Dartmouth. Your third one could be Korean or your native first language, whichever one that is, if you're having difficulty coming up with a third one. So also too, don't take the SAT 2 language tests if that's your third or second language, because there's a whole country full of people who can take the SAT 2 Spanish, for example, without studying for the test at all and get an 800. So if also too, the SAT 2s are scored from 800 to 200 in increments of scores of 10. So the 2 or 3 most confident SAT 2 subject tests should be taken, because that directly has a relevance and impact on your admissions. So if you want to take more subjects to make your case better for admissions, but not necessarily SAT 2s, then use the APs, because SAT 2s are high school level, APs are first year college level. So APs, because they're a higher level in maturity level, they're a lot more impressive to university admissions officers. So SAT 2s then, because they're required, just take the 2 or 3 that you're most confident in, and everything else should be APs. The Ibt Toefl, if you need to take it because English is your second language, whether you are a US citizen or not, it's not required if you're a US citizen, but it's recommended, especially if your first language is not English. You could send that score. They won't require it, but you can send that score and they'll look at it. So the rule is it's required for the Ibt Toefl if your SAT 1 verbal score is 430 or below. I think that would be like I should have looked that up in the ACT too. But you can look it up online what a 430 reading score equivalent is in ACT. But if it's a 430 or below, you're required to take the TOEFL test. I heard this from another admissions officer at an international school in Korea. And he has a lot of experience, and so I take his word for it. If you score, he said, 600 or below in the SAT 1 reading, and again, look up the ACT equivalent. If you score 600 or below, you should take the Ibt Toefl test. You should take, not required, but recommended, because the difficulty of the ACT or SAT 1 reading is much, much more difficult than the TOEFL. So because of the difficulty level, as a second language speaker of English, you might do worse in the ACT and SAT 1, but because the difficulty level in the TOEFL test is much easier, you could do a lot better in the TOEFL test comparatively to the ACT or SAT 1. So it's recommended to show that you are a viable student when you get on campus, and you could learn these classes in English and write your essays in English and do all these things in English to show that you're a viable student. So Ibt Toefl. So Ibt Toefl is not like the ACT or SAT 1. You don't need to get a higher score in TOEFL to get into the university. So it's an on-off thing. If you score high enough to show that you have proficiency in English, that's good enough. So 105 is about the best score you can have in TOEFL test to show that you have quite a lot of proficiency in TOEFL without needing to score any higher. Most universities, if they have a minimum requirement at all, the highest requirement is usually 100 on the Ibt Toefl. There's also 90, 80, and 63. Okay, so maybe as a general rule of thumb, there are no minimum TOEFL requirement for top 50 ranked universities, because if you're applying to top 50 ranked universities, they figure your English is good enough. But most 50 to 100 ranked universities require a TOEFL of about 100. Below about 80 rank to about 100 rank or below, they'll require something like 80 or 90, depending on the school. Sometimes 80, sometimes 90. If you get into California State University schools, I've seen those schools have a minimum requirement of 63. But California State universities are quite good universities, actually, because they draw from the same pool of university professors as the University of California schools, and they're paid the same rate. So the quality of the teaching is the same, but the price of tuition is much lower. It's like with dormitory and tuition, it's like $30,000, below $30,000, while University of California universities can be $70,000. AP subject tests. So AP subject tests are college level again, so they're more impressive than SAT2s. AP tests are not required for admissions at all. Okay, so they're only tip factors. So again, in one of the YouTube videos that I made for grades alone, I said that universities are ranked in groups. So if you want to get into this group of university, you need to have a certain GPA, you need to have a certain SAT1 or ACT score to get into this group. So public universities will be a very specific, not a group, but a very specific line of SAT1 score or ACT score or GPA, okay? But private universities will be like a group. And so if you have higher AP scores or more AP scores, you can get into this group, most of them in this group, more favorably. So if you can get an A in the AP class, take the AP test too. And universities like that you take AP tests on your own, with studying on your own, without taking the AP course. But vice versa, if you take the AP course but don't take the AP test, that looks bad. Universities like students taking the AP test without taking the course, but high schools sometimes hate it. And counselors will penalize students for taking the AP test on their own because they think that students are score crazy and that they will ruin their GPA in general and make their profile much, much worse. So figure out what your counselor's position is on this. Usually international school students, counselors, and private universities that have a lot of Asian kids usually don't like kids to take a lot of APs in sacrifice of their GPA, for instance. So it can be used, AP scores or SAT2 scores too for that matter, can be used to make up for low grades in a student's transcript somewhere. It can be, but the transcript low score is there already. It's not erased, but the AP or SAT2 score can kind of make up for it and give at least another point of view. Maybe you had a bad teacher or some teacher that you didn't work well with. You wouldn't say that in your application, but you would say that maybe in an additional information field. Even though I did not well in the class, I wanted to show that I'm a viable student. You would add that in like maybe 2-3 sentences. So basically a rule of thumb about AP subject tests are IBs are difficult because of which high level or standard level class you're going to take. If you don't know what IBs are, that probably didn't make any sense to you, but APs are more difficult and are more impressive to universities in a different way. The more APs that you take, the more impressive you seem. APs, as a general rule, about 10% to 15% of students get 5s. For AP students who are applying to universities, they're taking those AP courses because they're quite good students already. And if you're quite a good student, to test in the top 10% of the nation of USA And the whole world, for instance, if you're quite a good student and you're taking AP classes, scoring the top 10% nationally isn't that hard for those kinds of students, for students that are applying to top shelf universities. So, so taking like maybe as many as like 10 AP tests can help you a lot with your admissions to Ivy universities and top 10, top 20 ranked universities. But it probably won't be recommended for anybody else. So how many APs should you take? Rule of thumb is take as many APs as is about your level student in your high school. So if you're in the top 10% or top 25% of your high school, what is the prevailing number of APs that most students in that group of students are taking? Usually it's not more than 3. It's not more than 3. So 3 APs and 2 SAT2s are fine. If you want to get into the really heavy duty universities and you want to contest the number 1 student or number 2, number 3 student in your high school, take 10, take 5, take 8. But if you're like maybe 20 ranked student, don't take that many. Take about 3 and that should be good enough. You're not going to get into Harvard, but you should go into the top 20 universities fairly well. Maybe not the Ivy Leagues or maybe the low Ivies or the lower top 20 ranked universities. You should have no problems. So AP is not requiring prerequisites. These are good classes to take raw. When you've never taken any prerequisite courses or you don't need any additional knowledge to take these courses. So AP Economics, Micro Macro, if you read a lot of newspapers, you could kind of figure out a lot of the terminologies or a lot of the terminology will be familiar to you in AP Economics classes. Psychology too, you know, passive aggressive or words like that will be fairly familiar to you just from reading newspapers or in regular life. So psychology is very easy to kind of take on. Environmental science is kind of a low-level version of life sciences. So it's not as difficult as biology, AP chemistry, but it's kind of a mix of everything. Environmental science. It's more ecology too. It's more plant science too. So since it's a basic level compared to biology and chemistry, you could take that class easily without any prerequisites. Human geography is kind of like geography, maps, plus sociology. So studying cultures, studying people. So you don't need a lot of prerequisites for that too. Statistics is, and everything else below this is pretty hardcore math and science. So it's a little bit more difficult. It's a lot more difficult sometimes. But you technically just need some algebra and some geometry and some, I don't think you need as much as pre-calculus, but you could take the statistics course and you need a brain for math to do this. Computer science A is Java. Computer science principles isn't any computer language at all. It's just doing a lot of flow charting, doing a lot of the mechanisms of computer design. And then these are more, so previously were ones that were not necessarily hardcore English. These are kind of hardcore English, but they're easier than like English literature and composition. So English language, not a lot of people take English language and composition, not as much as English literature. So there's not a lot of literary analysis. It's more argumentation. World history and European history, a lot of American kids don't take world and European history, so there's not as much competition. Government and science comparative, not US, comparative. Not a lot of US students, again, take that course, so it's not as competitive. The APs requiring prerequisites, though, are mostly the science and maths. So, but a lot of second language speakers of English are very happy with taking these courses. So calculus, you need so many prerequisites, and those prerequisites are considered difficult enough that almost 45% of the students will get 5s on AP Calculus, BC, and AB, although it is still a difficult test. Chemistry and biology, you do need some fundamental science thinking to take on those courses. The physics courses, C is calculus-related physics. Physics 1 and 2 is non-calculus physics. So the APs that are difficult or competitive, the math and sciences are difficult and competitive too, but I've said that these are difficult and competitive because a lot of American kids, as second language speakers of English, you can't compete against really, really talented native speakers of English, American kids that are doing really, really well in their humanities and English, in US history, in AP literature, in AP government and politics US. Because US history and government politics US, American kids have been taking US history and government civics since elementary school once, junior high school again, high school again. So they're taking it a third time around, and you're competing against those kids that have taken a third time. So very, very difficult government politics US and US history. So unless you're very, very confident that you can do it well, I wouldn't recommend it. It is, in the opinion of many students, less material than world history or European history. So a lot of students consider that it's a lot more accessible. I would recommend talking to your teachers about whether you should take US history versus world history or European history. They would know you better than, and the test too, so they could make a better recommendation. Again, English literature, the kids that in America as first language speakers of English, when they do literature well, they can do it phenomenally well, astoundingly well. You can't compete against those kids. So unless you're really, really confident, I wouldn't recommend it. Even then, if you're fairly confident, I would recommend English language and composition and not literature first. And then see what that feels like before you attack literature. So there it is. We can do all of these subjects all year round at Stephen Academy. So come to us for AP classes. Tune into other YouTube videos about other elements in US college admissions. Okay? My name is Steve Ha for Stephen Academy. Thank you very much, and we'll see you next time.